Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel. And today from our store, I've actually brought in a book, a medieval book. And I will add here, this is only a replica. As we often say, we do use original items, but really original items that we use really date from the Victorian period and beyond. And the main reason for that is the items are not rare. You can pick them up in, for example, antique shops, car boot sales, or even in charity shops, for example, especially if you think of an old Victorian flat iron or something like that. However, when we talk about earlier periods in history, be it medieval, Tudor, Stone Age, things like that, we generally use replicas. But when we get replicas, we always source the best replicas just to guarantee that the items look right. They're the right size, made of the right materials, and made in the correct construction methods. And that's really, really important because, as we always say, if we're talking to an 80-year-old, if we're talking to a 9-year-old or anything like that, no matter what the age, I think they have the right to handle something that looks right and is right. And the thing is, when we use replicas, it means that the original items, which are often kept in museums and places like that, do not get damaged, because they can easily be damaged. If you think of books, for example, they can be damaged just by the grease or sweat on the hands, for example, which is why you often see people wearing gloves to handle old books. So today we've actually brought in a replica item from the medieval period, and that is just of here. And it's a fantastic book. Books were very, very expensive. Very few people owned books long ago. We know, for example, monasteries had books, and people like monarchs had books, even though they very rarely read them as such. It was a mark of a civilized person, a mark of an educated person. And in some cases, monasteries used to lock their books up. If you ever get a chance to go into Worcester Cathedral, and not just Worcester Cathedral, but many cathedrals, they often have what is referred to as a chained library, because books are so precious. They were often chained up to the bookcases, so you could slide them out, take them to one of the reading desks, open them up, read them, and there's no way you're going to be able to walk out with them. And even trying to tear pages out, if you try and tear pages made of vellum or parchment, it's almost impossible, to be fair, because you have to remember, parchment, vellum is actually made out of animal skin, so it's very, very thin leather as such, really. So books were a status symbol. Books were very precious, very expensive things, and very few had them. But when we get to, for example, the late medieval period, in particular the 15th century, books are becoming more common. Now, I'm not saying they're common as in a peasant would have one to flick through in the afternoon, but what I mean is they're becoming more popular and more easily purchased by people of not the lower classes, but of society. More and more people are having them, and they would have looked like this. The early ones would have been handwritten, and they would have been extremely expensive and wrote on parchment and vellum. But then eventually they started using paper, and most paper was actually made out of old linen rags. That was one of the most common ways of making paper. And with the invention of a printing press, you then get, especially by the 15th and into the 16th century, lots and lots of cheaper books being produced. But the problem is, to manufacture a book was very hard work. Now, I've watched a book binder work, and it is quite an amazing thing to see. I actually knew someone that used to make books as well. And it involves taking all the leaves of paper and then stitching them, and then it was a case of stitching them into a spine, for example, and then finally you've got wooden boards, and that's what's inside here. It's not cardboard as we would on a hardback book today. These are actually wooden boards, and then with lacing and also stitching, the boards would have been bound around it, and that's what makes them so expensive. Like I said, they were becoming more common by the 15th and 16th century, but we're still talking about the upper classes. Lower classes would not have used them, really. And two of the main books that were often held inside homes were Book of Hours, and there was also a Book of Days. Now, the Book of Hours are interesting because they're often filled with the orders of Mass, for example. So you have to remember, we're talking a period where we are of the Catholic faith. So it laid out the order of the day as in times of prayer, basically. And they often followed the monastic method. So even though they wouldn't be getting up at 3 a.m. or anything like that, like the monks were doing, they would have followed pretty much the prayers of that time. And they would have also had, for example, small amounts of text in there from the Bible. They would have also had some interesting snippets about saints, for example, and also the Psalms. And that's why we do get them being called a breviary. And also psalters, for example, and that's what they were. They were important devotional books in the household, and the idea was when people felt like it, when people wanted to, they could take the book, pick it up, and read a few lines from it, a few passages from it, have a bit of contemplation, quiet prayer, a quiet bit of meditation as such, and then put the book back. But this one is actually the second most popular book that they had, and this is the Book of Days. Now, the Book of Days is really, really good. I bought the Book of Days some time ago from someone making replica books because it's quite useful for when we do a lot of talks for groups, for example, on some of the saints' days. For example, St. George's Day being the most popular. Now, this is basically a calendar of the saints. And what is interesting, you can look up any date in here. For example, we could turn it to today's date. So we're on to, here we go, just find it here. Almost there. 26th of February. And the 26th of February has got a printed page here, so it's not printed on calf skin, it's not printed on vellum or parchment, and as you can see, it's a printed page, and it says for the 26th of February it's Saint Alnath, and that is the saint from Stow in Northamptonshire, and he is quite a vague medieval saint or early medieval saint. He's actually an Anglo-Saxon, and it gives a small snippet about his martyrdom as such. And it says here, he led life of a hermit in the woods of Stow. And then it also goes on to say he was murdered by pagans. So he was obviously an early Christian convert, and he was murdered by the pagans, the people of this land, or maybe the newcomers, the Danes, that sort of thing. And because he was hated for his faith and holiness of life. So on the 26th of February, we should be celebrating that saint. And the interesting thing is, there are a lot of saints, and some people will actually say, if you think about the Catholic Church, the Christianity that came in, and like I said in previous videos, it was sort of trialed in the Roman period, fell out of favour, and then became a big Anglo-Saxon thing that's still here today, Christianity. It is quite interesting that you have many gods in pagan culture, be it in our Iron Age culture, the so-called Celtic culture, or even the Roman ideas. But then when you get Christianity comes along, you do have the gods turned into, in a way, saints. The saints take over from the gods, really. So whereas you would have this massive book of different gods in pagan times, we now have a massive book of saints. It's very similar. Some people actually say you can see how the conversion is there. And it's the same with the things like Eostre and in what we would call winter solstice, and they get turned into things like Easter, and they get turned into Christmas. So you can see how slowly Christianity takes the old pagan ideas and alters them, changes them over time. But this is quite an important book. So every day you may get the owner of this book, take it and look at what saint day it is. And there are saints days throughout the whole year. And the interesting thing is several dates will have more than one saint on them, and you will see that in this book here. Saints days are feast days, so there were usually days where you pray to that particular saint, and then to end on you could have a feast to remember that saint. Some saints days would involve a certain ritualized type of thing as well. Not all of them, but some of them could. And these books were often family heirlooms. So in the 15th century, for example, this would be given down through the family, very much like you would have a family Bible. I know a lot of families do have family Bibles, and they are really interesting. Family Bibles, if you have one, what is very traditional is to write the children, grandchildren, and that's names in the front cover, and then, like the Book of Days or Book of Hours, it gets passed on. The other interesting thing about these books is we do have a lot of them that survive. And if you go to places like the British Library, the British Museum, and even if you just Google them, you will be able to find quite a few different Book of Days and Book of Hours that are beautifully illustrated. And I mean like illuminated, as we talked about in a previous video, where you would have gilt work, you would have gesso work, you would have very intricately painted pictures around them. This one is a printed one, so it's much more basic. Eventually, when you get the Book of Common Prayer and things like that, these are almost obsolete. Some families still use them, but when you get the full break from the Catholic Church, these are almost illegal items as such, really, and they would have started to disappear. But luckily, like I said, a lot of them do survive in places like the British Library, and it is really worth having a look at them. Some of them are absolutely beautifully illustrated. But as I say, we like to use it. One, because it's a nice prop, a medieval book, but also it's a nice book to talk about the saints when we do talks on some of the saints. Because when we do talks, we do quite a few that links with events. For example, in sort of November, December, we do a lot of talks on Christmas, for example. When we get to April time, we do a lot of talks on spring. We also do a lot of talks on St. George's Day. And sadly, with lockdown, we haven't been able to do any of those talks. But if you look through the playlist, you'll be able to see, for example, some of the talks that we've done on these events, and they include things like Mother's Day. We did a talk on Mother's Day last year, because obviously that was done in lockdown. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of enthusiasm to go and have a look, because remember, that's the aim of these videos, really. Stay safe, stay in, and obviously we're up to the weekend almost, so have a fantastic weekend, and hopefully the spring sunshine will continue over the weekend. So on that note, stay in, stay safe, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.